recorded the last one. The goal to record is that we're recording the slides and the screen and the conversation, not necessarily the video. But I just want to make you aware. So if you prefer to share your questions on the chat or save them and send us an email, just so you know, we're doing this so we can then post it to our YouTube channel. And then folks who were unable to attend today can gain access. Or if you just want to sit back and relax and then rewatch the video or share with others and find the information we cover more easily, then that's what we're recording for, okay? So, if you have not done so yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. YouTube apparently is making a comeback, and so we are saving not only the recordings from our professional development committee, but we're also sharing recording from other committees. We have important conversations. And so it's a great video library resource for you. I also want to take a moment to remind everybody, if you haven't done so already, to register for next week's webinar on federal rights of English learners. As you can see the information on the screen, we're going to have great guest speakers. It's in partnership with the New Jersey Consortium for Immigrant Children and ELC Education Law Center. The registration has maxed out several times, so we've had to create new Eventbrite links. The most recent one to register is the one that you see on the screen. Please kindly also share that with your colleagues, your peers, any network that you have with family guardians of your multilingual learners. As we all very well know, the U.S. education system is really set up as a partnership. So if you don't have that partner at home, you're already working at a disadvantage. And we do have families who do want to participate, engage, and it's important they understand their rights so then they can further advocate with us. And so to get us started today is the last PLC that we're offering for this academic year. This year, we center all PLC series under the banner of teaching bilingual students bilingually when. Our first one, we talked about when we had different types of programs, we have different types of learners. Then in our second webinar of the series, in January, we talked about twice exceptional multilingual learners and special education. And then today we're going to talk about teaching bilingual students bilingually with an assets-based approach. And as you can see, we're going to talk a little bit about the bilingual programs in New Jersey. Then we are lucky to have Maggie Churchill as our guest speaker, who's going to present on our bilingual standards in New Jersey. And then a lot of us submitted some questions when we registered. So then we'll also have an opportunity during the Q&A to go over your questions that you may have now and those who were submitted before. And so I would like to invite my co-presenters to introduce themselves at this time. Kathleen, you're up.
Okay. My name is Kathleen Fernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of NJTESOL-NJBE. I am a retired ESL teacher, and I was a teacher for 30 years.
My name is Cecilia Vila. I am the secretary, one of the officers of the board NJTESOL-NJBE. I'm also the chair of this professional development committee. I'm a supervisor of pre-K-12 bilingual ESL programs and social studies. And I am a multilingual learner myself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Churchill. I'm the past president of NJTESOL-NJBE. Currently, I'm the committee chair for our scholarship committee. And I'm an ESL teacher.
The reality of what love is.
And nothing,
well, that was
and
beautiful.
Nothing can replace that. There you go. That's a great theme for today. We're just going to run with it. So thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, Maggie. A lot of intense conversations this Saturday morning. All right. And to get us a little bit focused and center and make sure we all logged into the right Zoom this morning. Really the purpose of this PLC series, as you all well know, we are also NJBE, is to support all educators of multilingual learners to teach your students bilingually. That is not necessarily referring to people who are blessed to have a full-time bilingual program with bilingual, bicultural, and certified teachers, but all of us who are teacher multilingual learners, who are emergent bilinguals, how do we do that? How do we foster that whilst or within the programs and resources that we do have? So I'm going to pass it on to Kathleen to get us started with the different programs of bilingual programs in New Jersey.
Okay, thank you. All right, what we have here is the current bilingual education code. You can see that this became effective last year in August 2023. And the general requirements that are pertinent for today are that programs are culturally and linguistically responsive. They need to be research-based and effective language instruction educational programs. The code says that we should promote bilingualism and biliteracy and cross-cultural competency. Also, that these should be done at high levels of academic achievement in English and in the student's primary language. Also, the state highly supports their seal of biliteracy. This is incredibly important, and we really want to have more of our multilingual learners achieve this award. It's economically, a great asset, and it's an honor that not every student can receive at graduation. Okay, next slide. Some definitions that were updated. Bilingual education program in the new code is a full-time LIEP, Language Instruction Educational Program. That's a new acronym that the state has. In all courses or subjects, they would receive instruction in their primary language and also in English. Every bilingual education program, the students should have ESL every day in addition to their bilingual program. They also defined what a class period meant. So a class period now is the school district's time allocated for instruction in academic content areas as part of the regular school schedule for each day. For a block schedule school, weekly instruction is equivalent to one class period for each day of school in a given week. And then dual language programs, dual language immersion programs are programs in which multilingual learners in the program receive instruction in their primary language as well as ESL instruction. And the dual language immersion program provides daily instruction in English and a minimum of 50% in the primary language of enrolled multilingual learners. A dual language immersion program that is designed to support multilingual learners is sometimes referred to as a two-way bilingual education program. So the programs that are recognized in the state of New Jersey, the first one is English as a second language. So if you have 10 or more multilingual learners in the entire district, not a school, it requires that you have a certified ESL teacher, that it meets and that class meets every day for the amount of time that an academic class period is. If there are less than 10 students identified who are multilingual learners, it does not require a certified ESL teacher. It does require a certified teacher or specialist, so it cannot be an aide providing those services. Bilingual education must be provided in districts with 20 multilingual learners who speak the same language no matter what grade level they are. So throughout a K-12 district, if there are 12 students, that district must provide some type of bilingual education. That curriculum for bilingual education is aligned to the NJSLS and ELD standards, and the purpose is to further master literacy in the primary language as it supports development of English language proficiency. And again, you can see at the bottom, students receive daily ESL instruction, as well as the bilingual education curriculum. The new definition, I talked briefly about dual language immersion. These programs are designed for achievement in English proficiency and in a second language. And classes for a dual language immersion program shall be comprised of at least 50% multilingual learners. Sometimes these programs are coordinated in the world language area of a school district, and certification is required in grade level or academic content area and bilingual or bicultural education or world language. So there's a lot of different certification areas required for a dual language immersion program. Because districts have difficulty creating bilingual programs, because of a lack of bilingual teachers, because they have 20 students who are spread over multiple grade levels, the Department of Education has these instructional program alternatives that are available. One is a bilingual part-time program, a bilingual resource program, a bilingual tutorial program, a sheltered English instruction program, and a high-intensity ESL program. All of these programs are created and reviewed by the Title III office. You cannot just create these on your own. And if you create one of these programs, you will meet with the Title III office annually regarding a waiver from that office. All right, Maggie, you're up. Applying bilingual standards in New Jersey in bilingual programs.
Apologies, I kept struggling to unmute.
That's fine.
So before I invite Maggie to jump on up, I wanted to add a couple things to a couple of your slides. So the document you see on the left-hand side, right, it says that it's effective this year, but the leaders in each district have until the end of this academic year to update their programs and their processes and guidelines to comply with all the items that you see on this chart on the left side of your screen. I think the commonality and the purpose and reasoning behind it and this shift of language, right, from ELL to multilingual learners, you hear the word biliteracy, seal of biliteracy, bilingualism is the Department of Education, as I'm sure you've seen Secretary Cardona on social media, the NJDOE Title III office, they're trying to elevate, right, those assets-based approaches that we have towards bilingual education. And one of the challenges that we often find is, well, how do we do that, right? When we only have monolingual teachers available, right? Or when we do have a limit on these resources. And so part of the goal of these conversations that we're having here today is how do we teach students bilingually when we can't run in necessarily a full-time bilingual program or a dual immersion program, right? The definition of what all those programs are is on the NJDOE Title III page. I think it's important to understand some non-negotiables. So as you can see on this first screen is what I like to call Plan A, right? If we are able to have Plan A, which is a full-time ESL, full-time bilingual program, these are the requirements. And then we start moving to Plan Bs, right? Which are the alternative programs that you see on the right-hand side. A definition of these programs, a generic loose definition of these programs. It's currently available on the website for the Title III office. And as Kathleen shared, those of us who are leaders in these departments and are responsible to submit the waivers have to do so by July 31st. And the waiver is done virtually, is done online. And what we do is we provide a count of how many multilingual learners of each language do we have across the district in each grade level. And then we select from a drop drop-down menu which of these programs we are committing to provide as an alternative to a full-time bilingual program. The waiver itself has been simplified over the years, so you no longer have a possibility to describe what your program alternative is. You legitimately just select one from the menu. So you get an understanding of the oversight that this process gets, because the less bicultural full-time programs we can run, the more waivers the office has to approve. You submit it by the end of July. I just received notification now in March that my waiver was approved. And so Maggie, I feel like you've rejoined us. Are you here with us?
Yes.
I think she was having
Yes, I
some
apologize.
difficulties. That's okay.
This is the second power surge we had in my town, like over some. So I apologize. I'm here.
Okay, so then with further delay, we're going to introduce Maggie and cross our fingers that she doesn't disappear again. She's been very generous to share with us her knowledge, her experience. She has been teaching bilingual teachers, so she's single-handedly trying to get us more bilingual teachers to come. If you scan the QR code, you'll have access to the slides she's going to present. They will also be attached to our presentation today. Okay, are you okay, Maggie, if I present your... Yeah? Okay.
I'm concerned I don't want to get like a blocked
You'll be
out
okay. It
again or
wasn't you.
something. Okay, good. Okay, so
Here we go.
thank you so much. Welcome everyone. It's so nice to be here and speak about bilingual standards in New Jersey. It's just a real honor, not just to work, of course, with NJTESOL-NJBE, but also to work with those of you who are teaching in really critical situations, and you're teaching the neediest of students, and we really are forging the path forward. There's so much to learn. You oftentimes are the only one in your situation, or only one or two people to talk to, but you always have the organization to turn to. So NJTESOL-NJBE really has stepped forward and tried to create those pathways to bring educators together. And so we're so excited to start this journey with you in the PLC, which I hope will continue. And also look forward to meeting you in person, of course, at our annual conference, to join chapters, your local chapter areas, which is another way to meet up with folks and talk about the issues that surround you in your community. So that being said, we're going to talk about standards in New Jersey. It's quite a list. So think of it this way. You teach the most standards of any teacher in the state of New Jersey. So we're winners right there, because we have the most. And it's a bit of a list, but it's also a selective list, so to speak. So of course we all teach the first, which is New Jersey Student Learning Standards, your content standards in content areas. If you're a bilingual teacher, in many cases you are teaching content. If you're an elementary school, you're delivering your content in the native language, while students are also learning English for typically one period. Might be a push-in situation. In a high school setting, you might be teaching math, just math, in a bilingual setting, a bilingual math class. So you're teaching that content. If you are currently, we're under world language standards for the actual instruction of language in the state of New Jersey. And if you teach a bilingual program that is not Spanish, or a language other than Spanish, which is what I'm calling it, then you actually fall under the world language standards. So these would be non-Spanish bilingual programs. If it's an Arabic bilingual program, a Haitian Creole bilingual program, and you're teaching language or within a language setting, which might be, depending on the program, within a language arts class, it might be a standalone class, it might be a push-in class. In New Jersey, there's so many different types of bilingual programs, as Kathy went over, and they're so specific in each district. And so your language standards currently fall under New Jersey Student Learning Standards, which comes from the actual foreign language or world language approach to teaching languages. Newly released just this year from WIDA are the Marco Dale, or the Spanish language development standards, which map very nicely, like almost, I'd say directly, probably like an 85, 90% correlation to the WIDA ELD standards framework. And so what's nice about that is if you're familiar with the 2020 standards framework from WIDA, then the Spanish language development standards will look very familiar to you. They have standards and standard codes. They include the key language uses. There are additional elements in the Spanish language development standards that you won't see in English language development because it's specific to the sociocultural lens through which Spanish is taught. And that actually is featured in the Marco Ale Spanish language arts. Although they're labeled as standards, they're not as codified as what we're used to seeing. So you won't see numbers if you're looking at the Spanish language arts standards, and it's actually more of a positional recommendation, almost like a stance with guidance, but it doesn't map to the WIDA ELD or the WIDA, what I call SLD, Spanish Language Development Standards. So that is our standard set, which you may or may not be choosing all of these, some of the above, all of the above. You're definitely not choosing none of the above. You're definitely choosing multiple answers here. So just to kind of clarify what those standards are. Thank you. Okay. So what informs our instruction, right? What do we turn to? Basically. So again, just a little bit further for each one. Marco Dali, this is the 2023, so just last year in the fall, WIDA kicked off their release of the Spanish language development standards, and that's a complement to the ELD standards. Really does map very nicely. It is there at the WIDA portal. It's available for download. There are correlation pieces that go along with it. They're continuing to release those pieces throughout the year. And if you sign up for, it's called the Monday Mail from WIDA, they actually will drop that right into your email, and you will receive updates as to when they have webinars. Some of them are free. I think some of them might be paid for. So those webinars are there and available to learn about both Marco Dale and Marco Ale as they continue to kind of it's basically a road trip they're taking throughout the year around the country to promote the standards, to release them, to do sort of wider cast PD for folks just to orient them to the standards. Marco Ale, as I mentioned, think of it as if you teach language arts in Spanish as a way to approach the Common Core, which is NJSLS, which is a revision of Common Core, in Spanish. So that actually is what helps bridge between NJSLS in language arts and Spanish language arts. So Marco Ale is really the lens through which to approach teaching in Spanish language arts. So it's really almost a view, a perspective, rather than prescriptive standards with numbers and codes, that type of thing, if that makes sense. And then finally, the WIDA ELD standards framework that provides our English content and also language and content together for teachers. You will also see the content and language, those key language uses that you're familiar with from ELD standards, you will see in the SLD standards as well. But like I said, you will see additional features in Marco Dale that are not present in ELD. Okay, so again, just a little bit more on Marco Ale. Since it's not as prescriptive as we said with standards, it's more the lens through which we view and teach and select, which helps us provide ways that we orient our ideology, our approach to teaching Spanish language arts, the practices of the discipline, which come more from Common Core standards that we also need to teach in Spanish language arts classes, but with the knowledge that certain practices are different or will differ. And then also basic concepts that do relate to the teaching of the key language uses, how we teach writing instruction, the focus on oracy and building oral language. And so that lens is prevalent throughout Marco Ale. And I might even suggest, because we don't really have guidance or guiding documents for teaching lots languages other than Spanish, that the same approach which you'll also see. I do have another slide deck, short one, that I can show after this that helps guide those who are teaching in multilingual classes or classes that are teaching bilingual education other than Spanish, as a way of orienting ourselves, our topics, our units, the way that we teach, the approaches that we take with our students that kind of ground it and guide us. Okay, so in Marco Ale, you have the 7 practices that inform instruction, and that is really what builds the lens that helps us make selections of text, how we create text with our students, the way that we synthesize information, right? Our critical thinking and reasoning, how do we analyze text? The critical piece of metacognition and metalinguistic awareness, building that within bridging, which is a piece that we'll talk about in a few slides, and collaborative practices. So you'll see some of these you have some of these pieces, a sense of some of these pieces that also translate into Marco Dale. So some of this additional correlation that I was talking about that's not 100% also comes from that idea of the lens that we teach through. So in Marco Ale, the basic concepts, of course, are to prioritize Spanish. We are building our 4 skills, but we're recognizing that Spanish speakers come with many different cultural experiences, such a wide variety of countries represented and cultures represented, and levels of familiarity and knowledge and skills within Spanish, including those who speak native languages, local languages, dialects. And so that is such an impact, especially recently with so many recent arrivals from so many different locations, that really builds a transcultural experience and a focus not just strictly on teaching Spanish bilingual, but recognizing that those students themselves are also multilingual students who speak additional either local languages, native languages, languages that might not be recognized or might not have a strong basis in literacy within our Spanish language arts classrooms. And so it also helps provide that context through which we deliver our standards to be more culturally responsive in our approaches. So Beeman and Uru have the Teaching for Biliteracy website features so much of their work, which really is the gold standard for teaching for biliteracy. And so from them, we have guidelines that we can follow in bilingual teaching. So what's most important, of course, is that all students receive literacy instruction, which is within language arts, within their native language, whether that's Spanish or another, in both languages. So literacy instruction in both languages, their native language as well as English, every day. So there's language arts in native language, Spanish, Arabic, whatever that is, depending on your district program, as well as English language. Okay, so those 2 periods of language, that's 2 periods of language arts every day, as Kathy mentioned. So there has to be one minimal period of ESL, as well as a period of bilingual language arts. So those are your 2 periods that students have language development every day from the very beginning, from their very entry into the program. So language arts classes focus on standards that are for that lesson, but what's important is that they are not repeated, and it's not the same lesson. So if I've taught that lesson in Spanish, we're not going to reteach it to you in English. We're not going to reread that story in English. We're not going to repeat. We deliver the content once. Content is delivered in the native language, and so there's no repetition. Students are differentiated within these settings. However, there's not separate instruction. So we wouldn't necessarily have, and we don't typically see for many times for practical reasons, because there typically aren't enough bilingual teachers. So we won't typically see separate instruction by levels within bilingual programs. Often these students are together in one classroom. So of course there's a strong need for differentiation in instruction. And so in the elementary settings, content and literacy, of course, are integrated. And again, content is instructed in the native language. So your day would be content instruction as an elementary teacher or a homeroom teacher. You'll be teaching science in Spanish, your social studies in Spanish, your health course in Spanish. They would have that language arts in Spanish, and they would have an ESL period, but content is delivered to the extent possible within the native language. Keeping in mind that districts often have, this is something I've been talking about a lot with my students, percentages or target percentages. So it may be a 90% instruction in native language at the beginning of the year and 10% in English, and the goal is to reverse that by the end of the year. So keeping in mind that we have content through native language, that's called content allocation. And again, no repetition in English. So again, from Beeman and Uru, the Spanish biliteracy best practices, of course, is to have students become bilingual, right? They are emergent in elementary settings, and the goal is to foster their development through a translanguaging stance. I do have some additional links to some of the things, Cecilia, that Dr. Seltzer has worked on. Of course, her original work on the CUNY NICEP Translanguaging Guide, which is in our second PowerPoint. So you'll have a link to that. That
Yeah,
kind
and
of
we're
really
covering it a little bit later
perfect.
too.
Oh, good. Perfect. Perfect. So robust instruction, of course, in both languages from the very beginning, with a focus on developing oracy. So we know from our work and our background ourselves that a strong native language development translates or transfers to a strong second language development. So the focus, of course, is on developing oracy first. We want to integrate language acquisition, content, and language together in both Spanish instruction and in English instruction. This is what our standards do for us. And then also in lesson plans, in our practice, in our units, that we maintain linguistic spaces for each language in addition to the bridge. So the bridge is the space between, or that interlanguage that develops between the native language and the target language. The bridge is identified in unit plans. It is something that is pre-planned, that's related to lessons that have been taught within the unit, that actually purposely showcases how the languages, both the native and the target language, are different or similar and different, how students can recognize the differences of each, whether it's vocabulary based with cognates, whether it's grammatical based, sentence structure based. And so the idea is to foster that metalinguistic awareness so that students build knowledge of how language works in each language, and then what that transfer is, what those differences are, and how they can recognize and use those differences. So open conversation and direct planning will help build those metalinguistic skills for students as well. Assessment is in both languages, but again, as we mentioned, there's no redundancy. In other words, there's no repetition. We don't then reteach the same lesson in English. And that is actually what helps optimize transfer. So when we assess in one language, we don't repeat and assess the same skill in a different language, because we want students to build the ability to transfer. So there are things that transfer from L1, native language, to target language, and there also are skills that reverse transfer. And so that's why we are not redundant in our teaching and our instruction. And then no strict separation. Again, this is a guideline. I know some districts also have practices where this week we speak all in Spanish, and next week is an English week. It is rather awkward because that's not how your brain works. So we don't just shut off our Spanish for a week or shut off our English for a week. That is not what the recommendation is from best practice, although I've heard that these practices do exist in districts. So how you choose to disrupt that is to you. We understand that, you're under these restrictions, but again, just keeping in mind what best practices are. Okay. So here I have just a snapshot for you from the biliteracy framework. It's a unit plan, or a template for a unit plan, if you will. And so really what this does is basically list out a sequence, requirements. If you're looking for a way to create unit plans, this could be a template that you could use. And so, of course, you have your theme, your unit identifier, and you have your big ideas, your content targets, what you are looking to assess. Those are the things that are going to frame your unit in that top right corner. And then, of course, all those standards that we talked about that we teach under content standards, English language arts, Spanish, right? ELD, SLD. So it's definitely a lot of standards there. And then the flow within the unit or within the lesson, this is really more at the unit level. It's what you're seeing here. Again, is the same approach, very similar to what we do in English ELL situations or ESL situations, where we build that background knowledge first. However, in biliteracy, we also focus on building oracy. I like to do these two things together at the same time. So oftentimes when I'm introducing a unit or a content topic, I also provide interaction at the same time. And that's actually what's going to engage kids around the content knowledge, is when they have the opportunity to speak with diverse partners and work on their oracy skills at the same time. I do that alongside with vocabulary development. These are often my grounding lessons prior to getting into the content. So we sort of build our knowledge first, build our capacity first, build our word capacity as well, and interact with partners, because we start to build that codependency. We start to build oracy first with partners, because that's the safest place within which students can start to interact with each other. And all this is done prior to a reading lesson, reading comprehension, all the different ways that we know about teaching reading, whether it's a read aloud followed by a close read, followed by a reader's workshop if you're doing Spanish language arts and you're working on skill-based instructions or strategy instruction. And then partner reading, where they would get to practice these types of things. So some of this comes from language arts teaching as well. And then, of course, writing. Again, typically from language arts teaching that we've borrowed, but then there's a focus within writing on word study, fluency, aspects of language that are specific to native language and target language. And this actually is what will help you select or choose items for the bridge, which comes a little bit later. So typically the items for the bridge may come from language differences based on syntax structure in a sentence, verb construction, the use of articles. That's a big one. Some of these are quite challenging and are very different. You might not even find that it might not be something to teach on the bridge if there are just too many differences. Some things that are useful are even not just cognates, but false cognates. What looks like it is a match that isn't. So that's something too to work with students maybe in a more advanced class or in high school level. And then, of course, your assessments that are part of this unit, whether they're teacher-based, they could also be observational. It does not necessarily need to be pen and paper, but you would include all of those. So your formative assessments, as well as your summative assessment for your unit. And then the bridge. What are the actual skills that you're looking to highlight, that you're going to discuss with students, that we want to point out? What are the differences to how they're formed in each language? And then whatever extension activities that are non that could still be assessment based, but I like to think of them as non-paper and pencil or non-computer based. So students have a chance to act out, or they have a chance to create something that allows them to demonstrate and perform another form of expressive language, which is what we want to build, of course, in both languages.
So I just wanted to add a couple
Sure.
things. I thank you, Maggie. I implemented this approach. I did write some of these units. I was in a transitional bilingual program. So even though we were a full-time bilingual program, English and Spanish, especially in upper elementary, the focus or percentage was really to transition students into English language learning rather than learning in both equally. And so the way this biliteracy approach, the way Teaching for Biliteracy, which is a company who has coined this approach, and they have a very extensive website, magnificent training, the textbook, if nothing else, is a great investment. And so the idea comes from a lot of the things Maggie already touched upon, that we don't develop languages in isolation. We do so concurrently when you have to, but also we don't do that in isolation from content and experience. And so the way I had to learn to understand this very well when I came from a different background of teaching students bilingually, is you start with an overarching theme. So all of this is still aligned with your content standards for language arts, for social studies, science, and mathematics, but you're thinking in themes and thematics for your units, right? A lot of the times logistically, and hence why this plan is color coded, is while we do not recommend weekly in English and Spanish, you do go about it in your day that way. In fact, the Teaching for Biliteracy framework is very explicit of maintaining the target language for the amount of time you're teaching in that language for the adult teaching the language. And so what I mean is when you see, and this is just the colors the company has chosen, when you see green, the language of instruction is Spanish. When you see blue, the language of instruction is English. A lot of the times, right, because we don't have 17 periods in a day, and because like Maggie said, the emphasis here is to integrate language and content, a lot of the times Spanish language arts is paired up with, say, the content of social studies, and English language arts is paired up with the content of science. So when you're thinking about thematics, right, if you're doing your Spanish language arts and you are integrating with social studies, the themes I would look for is what are those social studies standards my fourth graders need to learn? And that's how I match them up with this language arts standards. And so say I would have 3 periods in a day that were green and 3 periods in a day that were blue. For the time that I was doing the green, I, as the educator, I signaled that the target language was Spanish and I was to remain in that target language. Of course, because like again, Maggie said, we have multiple proficiency, multiple experiences in the classrooms. While the goal was to be in the target language, the students could interact in whatever language they were more proficient, right? But one of the key points of teaching biliteracy with the goal of biliteracy is that you don't find yourself code switching in the middle of the lesson, right? If we are hoping students think explicitly and consciously about what language they're using and how to use it, right? And those structures, they need to be able to stick to that language as much as possible. A lot of the times we confuse translanguaging with code switching. So code switching is that practice that you're speaking in English, pero también puedes hablar en español in the middle of the sentence. A child cannot code switch if they don't have the proficiency in both languages to do so, right? And so code switching allows me to kind of flip back and forth without maintaining those grammatical structures. It's almost like you're speaking two languages at once. And so if as an adult, I'm doing that with a group of students who aren't familiar necessarily one of the two, the students are missing part of the information you're providing, and hence why you should really try to avoid code switching when you're teaching explicitly in one of these content areas. And so when you look at this progression, right, and you're looking at building RC, background knowledge, reading comprehension, they're pretty specific. That's a continuum. And like Maggie said, it may take over multiple days that I'm building RC and background knowledge. There isn't a prescribed amount of time necessarily. It really has to do with what theme and what standards you're working towards. And so say that instead of working in social studies and Spanish language arts, I'm working on science, English language arts. So the first sequence of the biliteracy framework will be all in English. Then we'll have the assessment, which would also be in English, because that the summative assessment is what allow me to check, have you mastered the content that I just taught you in that language before I show you how to bridge it to the opposite. And so following the sequence, right, specifically is what allows to do what Maggie pointed out earlier, is transitioning from one language to the other, not necessarily repetition, right? Because we don't have the time to do that, nor do we have the need to do that. Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you. That's what's most important, is that we hear from practitioners, people who are actually doing this, and keeping in mind that, you know, each district has different requirements or different nuances. But again, that is the guideline for best practice. So just a little bit about transference, what transfers, right? What the bridge is and what the bridge is not. So if this is not something that you currently have in your units, consider making space at the unit level. So this would be at the end. Bridge is typically done at the end, or once we've taught those lessons that really relate to that summative experience, right? So here's where we're going to highlight what we want to focus on for transference, right? And that's the idea, is to promote transference from one language to the other. So it is something that's planned. It's end of unit. It's being conducted, as Maria mentioned, in that target language, or in the native language, all in one language. So we're not going to re-explain in English or re-explain in a second language. It's not random. It's not daily. So I'm just kind of reading across this. It is about transfer. What does transfer? It's also about taking a look at how things are and the differences. So what helps with this is you will often see bridge work. So there's what sort of bridging is the bridge work, like the work that you do with the students, and the bridge is what you identify, the activity that you identify and the skills that you identify for transfer. So it really is about looking at those differences, and that's why we often see charts. And so, yeah, go ahead. We're going to take a look just at some examples of those. And again, bridging is the work that you do, whereas the actual bridge is what you plan for. So there are different types of bridges. I have heard from folks who are teaching bilingually that they've been told only to do cognates. That's not true. There's different types of things that can be on the bridge. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I also just wanted to show you some examples of what that could look like. So it can be done as an illustration. I love that, especially if you're teaching something like an explanation. And so students need to see this visually. I love that for visual learners, for early learners. You have that in the same format in which it's taught. So that's just great. I love to see that kind of visual. It's teacher created, as you see. So in the side by side, this is where we have not cognates, but like words that they need to know. And you could also do this as cognates, as well. And then you also have how students need to say it, right? So us as a D say. So here it is in target, right? So you have side by side, I'm sorry, in native language and target language construction. So that's what's really nice is when kids need to actually see, oh, here's where this is. Here's how you're actually saying this, right? So can I show you how to give an example, right, in an explanation, what that flow of information looks like? If students are asking what that word is, which might be where they actually ask for just direct information. So you may have a direct information request to you where a student just doesn't know the word or the term, and you can provide that as well. But these are just different examples of what bridges look like, or just one part of the bridge.
And so, and to add to this, so part of the idea is you're training the brain of someone who necessarily does not have metalinguistic awareness, because we all know by now that simply because I am an emergent bilingual, it doesn't mean that I know how to think about my language, right? There are skills that once master makes us highly perform against a monolingual learner, but someone has to explicitly teach us how to train our brains to look for patterns, for contrast, compare, contrast, right? Similarities, use cognates. And so part of color coding, which again, it may be very simple, but attaching a color to the target language allows the student to unconsciously start sorting information, to start sort of sorting through the systems that already exist in their brain. A lot of the times I refer to a bilingual brain as a file cabinet. And so having systems for learning, such as in a contrastive analysis, I'm going to have two colors, right? Hopefully the children can tell green and blue apart. You're welcome to use different colors. But a lot of that is signaling, especially for newcomers, right? Especially for students who may not have had any exposure to, say, English, if that is the target language of the period, right? It allows them to start sorting independently, because what we really want to do is give them the scaffolds and the tools so they can access the rigor, but not necessarily lowering that rigor. And hence why the green becomes permanently attached to Spanish and the blue to English.
And also too that you'll see Spanish or native language first, right? So that's always consistent.
Correct.
You're always going to see that on top or on the left if we're reading left to right. So that's always presented first. That's always what's on top. That's always what's color coded. So that's what I just love is that Cecilia's done so much direct work in this and direct practice. So it's so great to co-present with her, really, truly. Just a little, some ideas on what's on the bridge. And I love kind of considering, other possibilities as well. So don't limit yourself to cognates only, even though I've heard that some districts are telling people that that's only what's on the bridge, but it's not. You're not limited to that. But if that's what you're being told, just keep that in mind when you're being observed. However, there are other possibilities for the bridge. So, phonology and sound correspondence is a big issue for so many students, and they often ask a lot of questions about this. And what I love is having these direct conversations that we're very explicit about. And that's, as Cecilia mentioned, it is that space where we create their capacity for metalinguistic awareness, where they start actively talking about their language learning, what's happening, what they see, what they understand, the noticing, how they're piecing together, because within their bilingual brain, they have access to all of these linguistic spaces, which are not necessarily separate, like Cecilia mentioned in that filing cabinet. They might not be in a file, they just might be in a cabinet. And maybe a little bit all over the place, which is exactly how it should appear. And so having that direct, explicit instruction in sound correspondence and what differences are, being aware of what sound challenges or which letters or formations would present a challenge to your student. That type of knowledge is going to be important because you're going to need to help with that or direct their attention to it. So letter differences, phoneme differences in English, right, with voiced and voiceless sounds, right? So where do they see these? Where do they have trouble with? What are the ones that they might need to focus on? How words are formed in languages. So we have so many prefixes and suffixes in English, which create longer words, which add meaning to words, which change words, parts of speech. Accents, my students often ask me, or we will often find ourselves talking about. So sometimes it's not just how you say it, but how I might say it compared to someone else. It is important that they listen to other speakers of the language, of the native language, of the target language, so that they're hearing different accents as well, so that they learn to just listen. There's so much text that they can listen to that's presented in different accents as well. Sentence structure and syntax. This, of course, word order within sentences is different by language. So direct discussion about this and direct planning about this is important. And also things like word connotations. I love these kinds of lessons. Students will often ask me when we talk about adjectives, like what's a way, sometimes they'll say to me, what's a way to say that someone is old? Or what's a way to say that someone's shaved, right? They're not exactly sure, and they have a sense of, maybe I shouldn't use these words. Which words are accepted, which words are not. So these are just some possibilities. But what's going to present itself to you from the bridge comes again from your unit, from your content, from what you're teaching. So it comes from the text that you're using. It comes from the lessons that you're working on. And then just an opportunity, since so many bilingual teachers already have some type of collaboration that might even be assigned to you, but hopefully, of course, it is something that happens within your school and within your setting, within your school climate that you teach within. So again, keeping in mind that that collaboration piece is essential. If the bilingual teacher is the one delivering the content as well as native language, then the ESL teacher is the one teaching English language instruction. So we don't repeat. We have that thematic teaching, as Cecilia mentioned. You have certain alignment in terms of what bilingual teachers teach, that content and native language arts, and what language teachers teach, whether it's ELD or bilingual or dual language. But what crosses over for both are those big ideas, are the critical questions, are the ways that which we build student capacity, the ways that which we foster their oracy and their reading skills, the things that transfer across that are everyone's responsibility, that we help students to see and understand better, and as well as the standards-based assessments that we have. So that's really what I think is most exciting, is the real potential for collaboration, and hopefully also that is something that that is valued in your districts and your communities as well. And hopefully you're given time to do. I have to say, oftentimes that's something that might be a challenge. And maybe even Cecilia can speak to this a little bit. As someone, as myself this year, who is collaborating with teachers directly in content classrooms, it is a challenge because we don't have designated prep periods. We don't even have common planning time. So I do recognize that challenge, but you already have this partnership. So I'm going to ask Cecilia just to kind of speak a little bit more about that before we finish off with this one.
Thanks, Maggie. I think that first and foremost, first of all, thank you so very much for sharing all this with us. This is a lot. Teaching for biliteracy was something that took me a couple years when I thought I was proficient at what I was doing. Then teaching for biliteracy entered my life, and even I was privileged to go to their paid training And still, what I realized, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, is language development, English, Spanish, or any language, right? When aligned with content attainment, has to be very explicitly planned for and very strategic. So just like Maggie said, what you use for the bridge, it's going to reveal itself. It has to make sense with all the previous steps because you're building towards something, right? And so when it talks about collaboration, interestingly enough, yes, it doesn't seem like we're going to have extra periods in the day anytime soon or extra hands on deck. And so what we really need to think about it is also think outside the box. I think that having templates for unit development, having all those items digitalized, it allows for you to co-plan with someone asynchronously. I think the most important piece is that it isn't necessarily that both teachers who are planning need to be proficient on all the things. They just need to understand how what they're proficient on fits with what you're proficient on, right? So
Yeah.
if you're co-teaching with a content area teacher, say, who teaches language arts, then they can be the masters of the content. I'll be the specialist on how we put hand in hand language development and content attainment. I think that over time, when you become proficient with how you foster biliteracy, regardless of what program you're in, then the next step is to see what already exists out there. You're not supposed to reinvent the wheel. You're not supposed to write your own curriculum, right? It's just see what you have and then measure it against what the end game is here, which is what we presented today, is the end game, like what the ideal situation would be, and you start working towards that. I think Maggie made a really good point and a really good suggestion. If you are to pick one thing of all the things, right, that we spoke about today, is that idea of the bridge. Again, fostering metalinguistic awareness in our students. The sooner we do that, the younger they are, the more successful they'll be as they go along. I often talk to folks and I say the brain of a bilingual learner is a really busy brain because at any given time, that learner's brain is doing three things simultaneously. They're trying to learn the new content, right? Just like any other student. They're also trying to learn the language for that content. And the third one, they're trying to learn those skills or strategies or that metalinguistic awareness that allows them to do all three things simultaneously, right? And so we are responsible to foster that, all those three areas in our learners, regardless of what our title really is. The reason Maggie's allowing me to speak about collaboration with no time in your schedule is because I'm an administrator. It usually falls to us. I also have one of my amazing person here from my team, from my ESL team, who I tasked this year to support teachers in collaboration with no time to collaborate, and she's been doing amazing at it. Thank you so very much, Maggie. I received some requests that you couldn't see the PDF presentation. I granted you access. We'll make sure you have access by the time we share all this information back with you. Again, it'll be through the QR code or the link down below. Next, we're going to move on to sort of like our Q&A. We had some teachers share their questions when they register for today's webinar. And so I listed the top 10 that we're going to address today. These are copied and pasted with how they were submitted to us. And then when you receive this Google Slides presentation, you will also have access to the resources that I included at the bottom to answer these questions that you have on this screen. So the first one, which is Maggie briefly mentioned, the concept of translanguaging. Again, I myself took me many years to comprehend the difference between translanguaging and code switching. And as so recently as of last week, someone who's attending a workshop by someone who's very well renowned told me, Cecilia, they're telling me that translanguaging and code switching is the same thing. I think that it's an ever evolving understanding really of different terminology, different concepts. But I think also if you yourself are not a multilingual learner, understanding how multilingual learners learn, it's a little bit challenging, right? So translanguaging, and these slides are prepared and this knowledge is shared by Dr. Kate Seltzer, who's part of our committee and could not attend today. She's by far one of the top experts, so I'm going to do my very, very best to explain it as well as she could have. So when you're talking about translanguaging, is really you're thinking about it through two lenses: the act that the learner does and the strategy that the educator does, right? And so when you think about translanguaging, it's really referring to those practices and ways in which we communicate as bilingual speakers, right? And then as the strategy is really an approach by our educators, so as teachers, in which we are trying to use all the linguistic tools our students have. So that goes hand in hand with that assets-based approach. I think that we often look at our multilingual learners from a lens of problem solving, right? Which unfortunately leads us to think of them from a deficit mindset. Like don't they have, what gaps do they have that I need to fill, right? But really translanguaging is highlighting that your students already come with a ton of preloaded software in their brains. And so translanguaging, when you do it as a strategy, when you plan explicitly for it, and you allow that to happen in your spaces, in your classroom, it is what is going to allow them, right, to acquire that additional language and the content simultaneously. And so what does translanguaging do for these multilingual learners, right? And it's a scaffold, right? Is that access when they're trying to acquire an additional language and they're exposed to a complex text or content. It also gives them opportunities, right, to develop those linguistic practices or moves for different contexts and purposes, right? Especially when we're talking about developing English in an academic setting or academic English. It also, from a cultural responsive lens, it allows them to maintain, validate, and elevate their own culture, their own identity, right? Which also impacts the social emotional development and well-being. And then it also allows to, when you make spaces for translanguaging, when you make spaces for our multilingual learners to use their entire linguistic repertoire, then you're obviously building a space that is inclusive. And again, we're not simply talking about full-time bilingual programs. We're also talking about teaching our students bilingually in all spaces. So what can translanguaging look like in action? So for instance, an example would be in a kindergarten classroom, right? Students partner up or they're in groups and they can discuss the prompt. While the prompt was in English, they can discuss it in Spanish, Haitian Creole, or whatever their home language is. But then they're supported, the process scaffolded for them to record their answers to your prompt in English. I think that a lot of the times, right, we are wanting to be very strict about how we collect information from students. And then the question that I always ask is, do they need to do the thinking in English or can they just do the thinking in any language, so long as then they're able to give it back to you in English? In sixth grade, translanguaging may very well look like they're able to interview a family member using their own home language about their experience in immigration, right? Then they're able to present this interview findings to the class bilingually, and then they can write that paragraph in English, right? And then as a scaffold. And then in older students, they may look like, say, in an 11th grade ELA classroom, they are in literature circles featuring books by multilingual authors whose writing contains both English and another language. They can not only talk about the plot, the theme of the book, but they're also able to talk about the author's language choices, right? How that shapes the characters and other elements of the story. I think that when you think about translanguaging, a lot of the times folks, especially with our newcomers, right, especially when we have growing populations of students whose languages we may not necessarily support through a bilingual program, a lot of the initial impulse is to provide translated resources, to provide a complete translation. And a lot of the times it's hard for us to understand why that is inappropriate, right? And so what I often say is using a student's home language or using translanguaging is like a strategy like anything else, right? It needs to be strategically planned for. It needs to be modeled. It needs to come with expectations. And then most certainly you need to be able to explain why you're using that strategy at that time. Because Dr. Seltzer could not join us today, she was kind enough to share her contact information. I strongly suggest you write it down. Any and all questions you may have about translanguaging, she'll be able to address with you. The second question that we had was, what is the connection between teaching for biliteracy and metalinguistic connections? I think Maggie did an excellent job addressing that, especially when we're talking about the bridge. I also added a link here at the bottom, right? As you can see where the resources are. The answer to question 2 is the multiple types of bridging from the website, the Teaching for Biliteracy. Number 3, I'm curious about materials and or resources bilingual teachers are using. I could provide you with an example that we use in our district. So in the district that I work in, we have a bilingual part-time program in one of our elementary schools. And that company, McGraw-Hill, provides both a counterpart to the ELA basal program, which is called Wonders. They offer that alternative in Spanish, which is called Maravillas. The one thing I appreciate about those resources is that while there is a symmetry in the scope and the sequence, it is in a translation of what the students are doing in the ELA classroom. It is really fostering the language development and the content area of language learning in Spanish. And so some of the stories that guide the units are differentiated for culturally reasons, but there are also a lot of the areas for phonics, grammar is tailored to the language of Spanish. If you yourself have any suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat of some materials or resources you are using in your bilingual classrooms. Number 4, how to encourage this language to fellow teachers who are biased and deficit-based. I think that by this language, the person was asking about how we transition from a deficit mindset when we refer to students to an asset-based approach. This is just simply my opinion, and we were briefly discussing this earlier. A lot of the people are asking me, but how do I do this, right? Like, how do I differentiate? How do I teach students bilingually? But while that sounds like the question they're asking me, what they're really asking me is, why should I do that, right? And so, number 1, you should do that because those are the students that you have. But number 2, I can dismantle bias and generational systemic racism that unfortunately really directs what and how we educate our culturally and linguistically diverse learners. But what I can tell you though is that you're not the only person who's attempting to approach their learning from an asset space. So then what I would suggest is that you find other positive deviant or positive disruptors that exist within your learning community. And so rather than focus on trying to moving those folks who don't think like you, I would think that it's better you invest your energy in finding folks that do think like you, right? And so I also added number 4, positive deviance. It is a way to approach education that has been researched, right? It has been heavily modeled, and that I feel like it's finding its ways finally in some of our district in a larger conversation. It's not really about telling teachers what to do. It's not really about telling teachers to add things to their already heavy plates. It's about finding in our districts, in our communities, in our schools, people who are really successful at what they do and partnering up with them. Number 5, what are NJTESOL accommodations for bilingual or emergent bilingual learners? I linked the manual, right? I don't know if the question was what accommodations are available. So when you check the manual, it will tell you. If the question was, how do I know what accommodations to provide? It once again really depends on what program do you have for bilingual students. So for instance, I'm going to give you, if you are a transitional program in which you have part of the day in Spanish, but say your science is exclusively taught in English, allowing your fifth graders to take the NJTESOL in science in Spanish may not be useful, right? Because while it is important to say, give them the trans adaptations, so the instructions are in Spanish, if the content has been learned in English and never has it been learned in Spanish, giving them on the state test in Spanish won't be helpful. Number 6, with the influx of students from all over, how do we accommodate oversized classrooms? Truthfully, I think you approach a large classroom like you approach a small classroom. You're really thinking about the students that you do have. You think about the minutes in your class period as money, right? You think about dollars rather than minutes. And so you think about how you want to invest those dollars wisely. Whether you have a large class or you have a small class, setting expectations for independent learning, giving the students the ability and the tools to work independently, regardless of what their proficiency is what is going to set your classroom for success. So you can differentiate, work in small groups, work in large groups, regardless of who your students are. Number 7, how can I effectively teach students that don't even understand me without being in small groups? Again, before I answer this question, I like to offer or challenge the way this question was worded. I would wonder how you know they don't understand you. I would also wonder if they understand you at all. Because if that's the case, then it's telling me your classroom needs to be, your instruction needs to be differentiated to give them access. I'm not saying you need to be speaking another language other than English if it's not the target language of your content area. I'm thinking then reflect upon, is my instruction accessible to older learners I have, whether a small group or whole group? And so to that question, I offer the resource of Shelter English Instruction Best Practices and Strategies by the Center for Applied Linguistics, which allows you to, how do you make your instruction accessible to all learners, regardless of what the target language is. 8, how to support the administration when observing bilingual teachers? I particularly enjoyed this question. As a full-time bilingual bicultural Spanish-speaking teacher, I was often frustrated and very prickly because I never got observed by someone who was multilingual, right? Not only did I not get observed by someone who had a specialty in second language acquisition, I got observed always exclusively by folks who were not able to speak, read, understand at all any other language than English. So then I, being the prickly person that I was, always chose to be observed when I was in my Spanish language arts period. And so the feedback they would give me was very general feedback as they could. It was never really necessarily specific to the teaching of Spanish language arts, which I found frustrating. But I also found that necessarily there were other things I needed to get better at. There were other things that I wasn't really doing that were not intrinsic to the target language of instruction. Having said that, there are tools, right? Say your district uses the Danielson framework for developing their district-based rubrics for teacher evaluation. The Danielson group, and I'm sure Marzano and the other groups have developed what they call crosswalks. So what to look at for best practices depending on the classroom that you're at. So in number 8, I linked a tool that aligns with the rubric for the Danielson framework and what specifically observers or evaluators should be looking at when you are in a space where there are multilingual learners, and the kinds of things you need to be looking at and evaluating, whether because they are present and that person needs to get the credit for doing it correctly, or whether because they're not present and you want to give that person the feedback. Then we have 9, what is the recommended percent instruction of native language? My answer is It depends on the bilingual program that you have. It depends on the grade level you're talking about. It depends on the learning profile of your multilingual learners. Those percentages vary. If you're in a dual immersion or two-way bilingual immersion, it may be 50-50. If you're in a transitional program when you're K2, it may be 80-20, 80 the home language and 20 English, and by third grade it flips. It really, really depends. From one year to another, even when we had the teaching for biliteracy framework, my instruction, my percentages really look different based on who my students were. If they're newcomers, right, and being that there are other priorities that need to happen prior to academics, a lot of the instruction was in their target, in their home language. And eventually by the end of the year, I was able to flip it. And then number 10, and this is where I'm going to back to Maggie, are there resources or guidelines for teaching bilingually to multilinguals who are not Spanish speakers?
So I just put together just some quick guidance for if you're teaching technically in a multilingual setting, which is how New Jersey, the state of New Jersey recognizes it, or I call it bilingual education for lots, languages other than Spanish. These terms just don't exist, so we make up our own. And congratulations to you, because you really are in uncharted territory, but you're not alone. We are here to support you. So the two best guidelines are really, as Cecilia talked about before, the translanguaging practices. CUNY NICEP has really put out the Bible, so to speak, and one of our committee members, Dr. Seltzer, who's not here with us, is one of the original authors. So we've linked that there for you. So when you get the slides, you'll get the link to that. It is their website. So there's the original guide, there's updates to the guide, and then there's videos for implementation of it. And it gets very specific as to like how to present vocabulary. New York City is really the authority on this because they truly have a multilingual, multicultural approach to language instruction because of New York City. It is kind of rare that you have almost bilingual settings. They're very school specific in New York City because most other schools have such a huge variety of languages that are present that they have moved to a translanguaging stance to accommodate all of that. And so that's becoming, we're starting to see this in our urban centers, not starting to see it, but we've been seeing it in our urban centers, mostly in New Jersey, whereas in New York City, it's throughout. So those guides at least prove helpful, ways to actually incorporate it within lesson plans as well. And then just in terms of your instruction as an instructional approach, I have a link there to Banks and his 5 dimensions of critical education. So by following this flow, within a unit. So beginning with content integration, knowledge construction that you do with students together, also including equity pedagogy, prejudice reduction, which can go beyond classroom and also to the school setting, and also ways to empower students within their school culture and framework as well. So those are just 2 guidelines real quick. And then resources, they're all linked right here. So the first is from the U.S. Department of Education. And it's their recommendation on pathways to multilingualism. The second is a very handy website that has so much embedded within it that was created by Paul Gorski. It's called the Teachers Multicultural Pavilion. It's a range of things that are there, from lessons and specifics to videos to ways to disrupt, as Cecilia had mentioned before, or also ways to teach. So there's a real range that's there. The third is an article. It's an analysis of Banks' framework. So it gives you those descriptions of those 5 areas. And then the last one, again, is another resource from New York City, Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, as a model to follow for unit construction and for ways of teaching in bilingual programs that affect or that focus on languages other than Spanish. So hopefully that'll give you some go-tos just to, kind of get started or to take a look at. And again, please reach out to us. We know that oftentimes those of you teaching languages other than Spanish, you are singletons. You are the only one. We are here for you as a support system, as an organization, as teachers, all of multilingual learners. So thank you again for being here and reaching out.
Amazing. Thank you so very much. So before we go towards the end, and we shared the links for you to complete your, to get your certificate, and we close out, I would like to open up the space for a few minutes. If you have any specific questions or general questions, happy to attempt to address those. If we don't know the answer, as always, we will find that answer for you. I do invite you to pose these questions in a way, right, in which we don't occupy negative spaces. I think that as much as we like to advocate for multilingual learners, even when we are advocating, we continue to speak in negative spaces. And I'm hoping we can move towards positive conversations, even though we all do have those frustrations. So if at any time, please unmute your microphone. If you want to turn your camera on, you can also post some questions in the chat. You're welcome to do so now.
I have a question. For the bilingual programs, are you using the same report card? Like I'm looking more at grading also.
Okay.
So are you using the same report card for the ones that you're teaching in Spanish? Okay, right now I'm teaching everything in Spanish. Are we giving them the same based on the standard? Because we're using NJTESOL, if nothing has been changed, this is like year 0 for us. But now it's where we're seeing a lot of difference between how we're teaching it and what we're teaching versus what's on the report card. For you, like your experience, is that, have you used the same report card or have you created a new one? Like, how do you approach that?
So as a bilingual teacher, we had the same report card as everybody else. I think the idea is that report cards that are standard-based report cards, not all districts have those. The core standards are the same, right? And so whether it's in English or in Spanish, we're working towards the same standards. So then the argument is you can simply use the same one. I would say that from a culturally and linguistically responsive view, if we are being responsive in the way we're educating our learners, then grading and providing feedback should be equally responsive. So I would argue that if what you are assessing is not represented on the report card that you have, then there needs to be a supplement to that, whether it's a progress monitoring form that goes to the parents, whether it's an addendum to the report card, or again, it sounds like you're at the very beginning of the conversation. And so things that strategically worked for me that I wish someone would have told me before I became permanently frustrated is that report cards get designed every certain number of years, right? So number one, I would find out what year you're in on the current report card that you have. Number two, when a report card gets redesigned, it's not one person who does the work. You have to do it through a committee. It usually takes about a whole year's worth of work. And there it's open to any teacher to sign up to that committee. And then it needs to be presented to the board. It needs to be approved. So it's a lengthy process. So by now, where in the process you are, and I think that's going to really answer what you're able to do with that report card. Ultimately, this is a very unpopular opinion, and hopefully the one teacher of mine who's still here is not paying attention right now. Report cards, to me, if the goal of a report card is simply that we're recording for legal purposes the progress of our students, am I going to pick that battle? No. If we're using it as a progress monitoring tool and feedback and building their social and emotional learning to guide conversations with the student, to guide conversations with the parent, I don't need the report card for that. I had multiple ways in which I collected that information and I shared it with the families.
Right, and that's, thank you. No, it did actually, because you actually went the way that I've been approaching it. And unfortunately, it has been something that it is a battle. Because for me, it's more having the conversation with the kids. This is how much you're making progress, because most of them have been in the country for a year only. Okay. So it's more of, okay, this is where you're growing, but we have a lot of gaps, as everybody has seen. And with COVID and coming from different countries, it's, I'm trying to piece things together for them. But it has been one of those things where, I don't want people to come and look at the report card and be like, oh, why are you giving this kid this grade when the rest of the kids in 5th grade are not mastering or they're mastering and yours are not. And I'm like, well, because mine are learning a little bit differently. Like I'm trying to get them to solidify their first language before they can do anything else. And that has been a struggle more than anything. That's why I think
it's always going to be a struggle because we're permanently trying to shove a circle into a square. And that's one of the most frustrating things we can possibly be doing. And so it really depends on the question they're asking you, right? Like if they're asking you, what data are you collecting that justifies they've made this growth or they haven't, you need to be confident on your answer, right? And that will be that. Where the one biggest practice that I think we need to do our very, very best to dismantle is comparing apples and oranges, right? Like while I do have a standard-based approach to say grading or whatever it is, you need to compare your students within your student group to demonstrate what the growth is. Trying to compare your students with the monolingual fifth grade across the whole is a fool's errand, and it doesn't give anyone any data at all. Maggie, sorry, go ahead.
You're going exactly where I was thinking. So Mercedes, my question to you is really, what are your multiple data points that actually show growth, right? So when you look at what assessments you're using bilingually, right? What are we using at intake for their assessment of Spanish language, and then what your midpoints or even your SGO, right? So what data do we have and where are you able to show growth? It sounds a little bit more like your conversations, a little bit more based on that. And these are the ways that you can demonstrate and show growth and talk to parents and use that to also leverage. This is really what our needs are. This is what the data shows, because just as it is in state law, we have multiple measures, right? So multiple measures in state law, and that applies to multilingual learners, which are who our students are. So we have those multiple measures in English and in native language. And we want to make sure that we have that our data shows that. If questioned, we can reflect that. And so, yeah, I do recognize so many districts are so different with all the reporting systems, but look to see what your multiple measures are, kind of have those that you're tracking, and that's going to help you show and demonstrate your data, whether it's to your administrators or to your parents.
I think also like in the bigger grading conversation, it really transcends any of us, really. I think currently the challenge that I'm finding between educators of any student is moving from a compliance-based system of grading of 100 points, right, to a system of grading that really fosters growth and independent learning, right? And so when we finally arrive at the latter one, it won't matter if they're multilingual or if they're not, because that's a system that recognizes the student as an individual. While we continue with these outmoded practices of grading, then we are going to have to just make it work, right? I often refer to us, those of us who are educators of multilingual learners, as time travelers, right? We come from the future where we know that multilingualism is an asset, that it can be done, that it benefits everybody. But we all accepted to travel back in time to the current time that we're now and try to move everybody along. And so it can be very frustrating. And to truthfully, there are certain things that really have nothing to do with our multilingual learners, and grading is really one of those. Thank you, Mercedes. Any other questions you would like to share? Let's see, any questions in the chat? Okay, I wonder how those grades will be interpreted in a district if they transfer out. I'm so glad you say that, but not even from a district to a district, right? Like how about students who are in transitional years, say a fifth grade elementary school, and they move into an intermediate school, right? Like that, there is not such as a handout. You just look at the report cards if you do, or your linkage or whatever is available, and you kind of have to interpret what they did. And so I think it's important for those of us who are in positions of having these conversations and creating systems in which maybe in a transitional year, there is space for a handoff, right? For the fifth grade ESL teacher to have a conversation with the sixth grade ESL teacher, right? Or can we collect some of the assets and successes that I've had with this multilingual learner, so when they start the year again with someone new, we don't sort of have to start backwards. Awesome. I love that idea of a package, report cards, access, benchmark, teacher. Love that. Compliance-based, CUSAC, we do have to keep certain information in their academic folders. Some districts go about it differently. The district I was a teacher in for many years, within their academic folder, there was a yellow folder. And so I knew that yellow folder within the academic folder had all the information I needed, right? Your placement letters, your identification letters, your refusal letters, your access scores year to year. So then I myself knew that when I received bilingual students from a different grade, my first tab was going to be that yellow folder. So I love that idea. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Thank you, Don. I did my very best to explain what translanguaging was. And to answer your question, yes, a PDF of the slides will be shared with all the resources. If nothing else, make sure you jot down our emails or names, or simply go to our website and you'll find our contact information there. And you send us an email and we're happy to answer any questions. At this time, I'm going to stop the recording. We're going to stop sharing, and then you are free to go enjoy the rest of your